Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is The Girl Next Door by Jack Ketchum. Now, The Girl Next Door was published in 1989, and this was adapted to a film of the same name in 2007, and this edition of the book I have is the movie tie-in edition, because the cover here is also the poster for the movie. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about the film adaptation of this book towards the end of this review. Now, I did do a review of this book a number of years ago, but I decided to redo it, not because there was anything particularly wrong with my old review, it's just that this is a book that I've been meaning to reread, and it's a book I've wanted to talk about again, and also Jack Ketchum, whose real name was Dallas Mayer, unfortunately died earlier this year, and so I wanted to review this book as sort of a, I guess you could call late tribute to Jack Ketchum, because of the 4 novels I've read from him, I think this is easily his best, even though his novel Red is also really damn good. Now, the novel is loosely based on the real-life murder of Sylvia Likens, which happened in Indianapolis in 1965. Now, this is not a true crime novel, nor is this a biography on Sylvia Likens. This is a fictional story, but it is loosely based on this real-life event. Now, even though the actual murder of Sylvia Likens occurred in the 60s, Ketchum sets this novel in the 50s, because I feel like he's trying to sort of make a commentary on the 1950s and people's attitudes back then, and I feel like he's almost saying that society's attitudes at the time almost allowed something like this to happen, and the book is really a commentary on child abuse. Like, he uses this real-life event to sort of make a statement about child abuse. Now, The Girl Next Door is one of my top 15 favorite novels of all time, not because it's an entertaining book, but because this is just such a powerful and heartbreaking novel. The book is disturbing as hell, it's depressing, it's devastating. Like, this is not an entertaining book, but I don't always read books to be entertained. Sometimes I read books to be taken on some sort of emotional journey, even if it's not a positive emotional journey. It's kind of, my attitudes towards this book are very similar to, I recently reviewed the movie Irreversible, and I said the same thing in that review. I don't always watch movies to be entertained. Sometimes I watch movies to be taken on an emotional journey, even if it's not a positive emotional journey. And if you're not crying by the end of this book, I'm not sure if you have a soul, and admittedly, I do say that a lot because I am a very emotional reader. Like, when I read any book, I get really emotionally invested in the characters, so much so that when something really sad or tragic happens, I do kind of tear up. So, I say that a lot, but I really do mean it for this book. Like, if you're not crying by the end of this book, or at least tearing up a little bit, then you're kind of an asshole. And I do consider this to be a horror novel, but it's horror on a much different level than a lot of the books I read. Like, this is real-life horror. This is the horror of what human beings could do to each other, and how despicable human beings can really be to each other. Now, the plot of The Girl Next Door is it's told from the point of view of a man named David. It's told from the point of view of him as an adult, reflecting back on something that happened to him when he was a child. The book is primarily set in the summer of 1958 when David was only 12 years old. Now, David was friends with these boys who lived next door to him, and their mother, Ruth, was what a lot of 12-year-olds would probably consider to be the cool mom on the block. Like, she would let the kids drink beer, she would curse up a storm, and she acted like, for lack of a better term, she was one of the guys. But Ruth's nieces, Meg and Susan, come to live with them after their parents were tragically killed in a car accident, and David immediately takes a liking to Meg. But as time goes on, it becomes clear that Ruth treats these two sisters much differently than she treats her boys, and it becomes apparent to David that there is some abuse taking place in this household, but he really doesn't know what to do about it, and eventually he starts witnessing this abuse. And while both girls are being abused, Meg is the one who's really taken the brunt of this abuse, and it becomes clear that Ruth has a deep hatred for Meg. And it starts off where Ruth just lets her boys pick on Meg, but whenever she tries to stand up for herself, she's the one who gets punished, and whenever she refuses to, take a beating, Ruth just beats Susan in retaliation for Meg refusing to take the beating. And as the story goes on, the abuse just gets worse and worse and worse until ultimately Meg ends up chained up in the basement where she is systematically beaten and tortured and even sexually assaulted and even raped. Ruth allows the boys to rape her. And eventually other kids from the neighborhood start joining in the torture of Meg. And throughout this entire book, David is a witness to all this, but he doesn't do anything because he's too scared to do anything, and he really doesn't know what to do. Now, one of the most interesting and complex aspects of this book is really the character of David, because he is a very complicated character, because you're not really sure how you should feel about him, because he's not a bad kid by any means. At the same time, though, you kinda hate him because he could have done something to stop this, but he didn't. Now, to be fair, he does eventually try to save Meg, and when he does try, you definitely root for him. At the same time, though, his actions are kinda too little too late. Now, the reason he didn't do anything was because he was just a kid, and he wasn't sure what to do. And also, children are expected to always obey adults, and here you have this horrible thing that's really being perpetrated by an adult, and you have an adult who's allowing this abuse to happen, and also this is an adult that he's known his whole life, so he really didn't know what to do. But you realize that the fact that he didn't do anything, it haunts him as an adult. You also very much get this sense that David, while he hates what's happening to Meg, he's getting almost like a voyeuristic thrill from what's happening, and is even titillated to a certain extent, which kind of makes you hate him more, but at the same time, though, once again, he is just a kid. He doesn't really understand a lot of what's going on. Or he understands it, but he doesn't understand what to do about it. And there is a really powerful scene in the book where David goes into his parents' bedroom while they're sleeping, and he hasn't told them anything about what's been going on next door, and he's just crying over his sleeping mother because he wants to say something, but it's almost like he can't. Now, you could call David the protagonist of the novel, but in my opinion, Meg is really the protagonist. This is really Meg's story, it's just being told from the point of view of David, but David, in a lot of ways, is more so the audience's avatar. It's being told from this outsider perspective, but in reality, this is Meg's story. In my opinion, Meg is very much the protagonist. And in the narration of this novel, the adult David who's telling this story, you very much get this sense that he's sort of idealizing Meg, and this could be his way of apologizing for what he did or what he didn't do by painting Meg as almost this Christ-like figure. And then you have the character of Ruth, who is such a hateable antagonist. She is such a... I want to call her a name that rhymes with hunt and starts with a C, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to call her a more politically correct name like fucking bitch. And just everything she says and the evil of this woman, it makes you so freaking angry. And what makes you even more angry is the fact that even though she is a fictional character, she is loosely based on a real-life person, Gertrude Banashevsky. So the fact that she's loosely based on a real person, once again, it makes you even more pissed off. Now, as I pointed out before, the actual events that this book is based on happened in the 60s, but Ketchum sets this in the 50s, I think primarily because he wanted to set it closer to when he actually grew up. But I think it's really interesting that this book is set in the 50s because I feel like the book is very much a criticism and a commentary on society's attitudes at the time. Like their attitudes towards the treatment of children and also to a certain extent the treatment of women in society. And earlier on in the story, before Meg ends up getting locked up in the basement, she actually does tell a cop about what's been going on, and the cop just kind of shrugs it off going, well, you know, I mean, it's technically her right. I mean, she is kind of your mother now. And it's like, holy shit, this guy could have stopped this from happening, and he really didn't. Now, to be fair to him, he had no way of knowing just how bad this abuse would eventually get, but at the same time, though, he could have done something about it, but nothing was really done about it. At the same time, though, while it's easy to hate this cop for his apathy towards Meg, you're not sure if it really is apathy or if he's just a product of his time, because at the time, children were expected to always obey the adults, right or wrong, and I do believe in respecting your elders, and I do believe in discipline, but there's a huge fucking difference between discipline and abuse, and what Meg and her sister Susan suffer in this book is abuse. Actually, abuse is too nice of a word for it. Also, there's a part of this book where you find out that one of the neighborhood boys who was taking part in the torture of Meg, he actually told his mother. He didn't tell his mother everything, but he told his mother certain things, and his mother just said, well, it's Ruth's right, and the girl probably deserved it, and that was just so freaking disgusting. There's also very much this commentary on misogyny in the book, because Ruth is very much a misogynist, despite the fact that she's a woman herself. And you very much get the idea that the reason Ruth is abusing Meg the way she is because Meg is a girl becoming a woman, and she's punishing Meg for sexuality. She's punishing her simply for being female. And throughout the book, Ruth tells Meg all these horribly misogynistic things and tells her that she deserves it because she's a woman, but you kind of get this idea that Ruth is very much sort of a victim of the sexual repressions of the 1950s, and you kind of get this idea that a lot of the things Ruth is telling Meg are things that were told to her. And it's almost her taking her frustrations about how women are treated in society on this innocent girl. By the way, I'm not trying to create sympathy for Ruth, I'm just saying that that's probably the way she's justifying, at least to herself, what she's doing to Meg and what she's allowing her sons and their friends to do to Meg. There's also a point in this book where David asks his father if it's alright to hit a woman, and his father says no, but his reasoning for why it's not alright to hit a woman is actually horribly misogynistic. He says it's not alright to hit a woman because you have to respect that they're the weaker of the species. And then he says, like he contradicts himself by saying, but sometimes it's necessary. Now, it's easy to hate David's father for his misogyny. At the same time, though, he was sort of just a product of his time, and that was sort of a prevailing attitude in the 1950s. Like, it's a commentary on how society almost allows child abuse to happen, and how society almost allows the mistreatment of women. And in this book, you have Meg, who's punished for not just being a child, but also for being a young woman. I also think it's interesting that Meg ends up getting locked up in an atomic bomb shelter that was built by Ruth's ex-husband, because this was the beginning of the Cold War, so I think it's interesting how the Cold War is almost like a backdrop throughout this entire story. But yeah, The Girl Next Door is such a powerful story, and it is a heartbreaking story. It's disturbing as hell, and it's certainly not a book for everybody. Like, I can only recommend this book if you know what you're getting yourself into, and if you do read this book, I will say, be prepared to be depressed and angry. One thing I think is interesting is Gertrude Banishevsky, the woman that the character of Ruth is based on. She was actually still alive when this book was published because she died in 1990, so I kind of like to think of this book as almost like a big middle finger to this woman. Now, the real-life Sylvia Likens and her sister actually had no relation to Gertrude Banishevsky at all. They were actually left in the care of this woman by their parents, who were circus performers. And in real life, Banishevsky actually had, I think, like 9 children. I could be wrong on that number, but I'm pretty sure she had like 9 children. So in real life, there were actually a lot more children involved in this than the book would suggest. And some of her children were grown adults at the time who also took part in this abuse. Now, there have been several true crime books written about the Sylvia Likens case, and this is actually not the only fictional story written that dramatizes this real-life tragedy. Now, as I pointed out before, in 2007 there was a film adaptation of this book, and this edition of the book I have is the movie tie-in edition, and this also comes with a pretty cool interview with Jack Ketchum and the screenwriters for the movie that shows up at the end of the book, and this edition of the book also comes with 2 bonus short stories by Jack Ketchum, and those short stories are Do You Love Your Wife and Returns. Now, it's been a while since I've read either of these 2 short stories, but I remember Do You Love Your Wife being just okay, but I remember really liking Returns. Now, the 2007 film adaptation I thought was pretty good, and it was extremely faithful to this novel. Like, there were points in that movie where you could tell they were taking it directly from the page. The only issue I had with the movie, now the actress who played Meg did do a good job in the movie, don't get me wrong. The only issue with her performance is the actress was in her early 20s at the time, yet the character of Meg was 14 years old. The issue is, she was clearly a 20-year-old woman pretending to be a 14-year-old girl. There was something a little awkward about that in the beginning, but granted, I completely understand why they casted a woman in her early 20s to play this role, because the role also involved nudity, and obviously you don't want an actual 14-year-old in a nude scene. But that being said, like, when the abuse starts to happen and when the torture starts to happen, that actress acts her ass off, and I think she did a really good job. I just thought it was a little awkward in the beginning, especially because in the beginning of the movie, she started talking like she was younger, like she was kind of using this voice that a 20-year-old would probably think a 14-year-old would sound like. Now, the same year that movie came out, there was also a biopic on Sylvia Likens called An American Crime, which was based on the same story, but it followed the true story a little more closely. Now, that movie wasn't bad. My only issue with that movie was towards the end, they tried to do this stupid thing where, like, the ghost of Sylvia Likens visits Gertrude Banishevsky in jail. Like, it's not literal, like, it's meant to be more metaphorical. I was just like, are you kidding me with that? But overall, it wasn't a terrible movie, and in the film, Ellen Page played Sylvia Likens, and she did do a really damn good job in the movie. Now, I'm friends with an author named Mark Allan Gunnells who actually wrote a similar book to this called The Summer of Winters, and I asked him if he wanted to do like a short review of this book that I could put at the end of this review. So if you enjoyed my review, here is my friend Mark Allan Gunnells' review of this novel.
Hello. My friend Christian has asked me to do a short review of the Jack Ketchum novel, The Girl Next Door. It is one of my favorite novels, so I was happy to do so. The Girl Next Door was actually the first Jack Ketchum novel I ever read. I had heard a lot of really great things about it, and it did not disappoint. It is a book I've only read once so far. It's a painful book to read, I won't lie. There's a lot of really dark stuff in there. That doesn't make it like if I'm looking for something just fun and entertaining, I'm not going to pick up this book to reread it. But if I'm looking for an expertly crafted, powerful tale, this book is it. It's really powerful stuff. and she does. I'm sorry, he does some wonderful work in this novel. Um, it has such an authentic feel to it, which is part of what makes it so painful because the characters feel real. The situation, while extreme, you could see it happening, and it's powerful stuff. And the character of Ruth is one nasty woman. He has created a real monster here, not the supernatural kind, but a real human monster. But what makes her so compelling is that she also feels like a real human. Um, she has these issues, these mental issues that make her behavior abhorrent. But at the base, she's a woman who is unstable, and it's just really heart wrenching stuff. You feel so much for Meg. You want to help her. You want to be able to crawl into the book and save her. And what I also like is the character of David. He's not just some one note heroic character who spends the book trying to save her. He's complicit in some of what happens to her, especially early on in the book. And as the book goes along, he becomes more her champion by the end, trying to get her out of this situation. But what makes him so interesting is that there is that dynamic where at the beginning of the book, he's sort of participating in some of the things that he shouldn't be, and even finding something titillating about it. It makes him a complex character that feels like a real person because he's neither saintly or demonic, but he's in this area in between where a lot of people live. And I can't say anything about the ending of the book, just that it is very powerful. It is very, I mean, it really kind of rips your guts out. It rips your heart out. It's that kind of book. And what what is so impressive about this book is that he has written it in a way that makes you feel all the emotions, all the weight of what's happening. It really, to me, it's a masterpiece. And I'm glad I have this copy. I've seen some early copies that have a ridiculous cover, I think, with a cheerleader with a skeleton head, which does not do this book justice. It's horror in the most potent sense, and I highly recommend it.
So I hope you guys enjoyed Mark's take on this book, and that was my review on The Girl Next Door by Jack Ketchum, and my next book review will be on an equally cheery novel, Rage by Stephen King.